The mountains always seemed safe to me, a place above the noise of the world, where the air thinned and the stars felt close enough to touch. I thought the silence would comfort me. I thought the tall pines and flickering campfire would keep me warm. But there's a stillness up here that isn't peace. It's the kind of silence that feels watched. Even the wind seemed careful not to stir too loudly, as though it might wake something older than the trees. I remember the first night clearly, the lantern trembling on its hook, the fog sliding between the branches like slow breath, and the way the shadows never seemed to sit still. I told myself it was only my imagination. I told myself the mountain was empty, that I was alone. But then came the sound of footsteps in the gravel outside my tent, slow and heavy, circling in the dark. That's when I knew the mountain was holding its secrets. And I never should have opened the flap to look. The forest breathed around me. Frost clung to the needles, sparkling faintly in the half-light of evening. The trees leaned closer than they should, their trunks dark and slick with shadow. A pale glow appeared beyond the pines. At first, I thought it was the last light of the sun bleeding through mist. Then I realized no sun could move like that. The lantern swayed, slow, weaving between the trunks. It was small, delicate, impossible to carry. Each time I blinked, it drew nearer, slipping through the fog like a secret. I stopped walking. The cold bit my cheeks, and my breath rose in quiet clouds. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, but beneath it there was something metallic, something sharp. I called out, softly at first. The voice barely left my throat. The glow blinked. Then it vanished. Silence stretched. I felt the soil underfoot, soft with decay and frozen moisture. And there, they were there, footprints pressed into the dirt, faint but definite, not human, not fully. I traced them with my gaze. They led between the trees, in and out of shadows, looping back like the forest itself had a pulse. I stepped closer. The lantern flickered again, just at the edge of vision. Each movement felt deliberate. The fog thickened, curling around my ankles, and the forest seemed to hush, listening. A twig snapped behind me. My heart paused. No one was there, only the whisper of wind. Or was it breath? I dared not turn. The lantern's light pulsed again, fragile as a heartbeat, then vanished into the gray. I crouched to inspect the ground. The prints were wet, shallow, glinting faintly in the dim. I pressed a finger to one. Cold, almost oily, and gone before I could pull away. It left a mark that burned like frostbite. A sound rose, barely audible deep in the trees. Rustling, careful steps, circling. Soft, deliberate, patient. Closer than the footprints. Closer than the light. I stood frozen, listening to the forest breathe around me. The fog thickened to my waist. Every shadow held shape. Every shape held a pause. I whispered my own name, low, unsure if it was my voice or the mist answering. Silence answered. Then a movement, a shimmer of pale light, gone as soon as I blinked. I backed away slowly, careful not to break the hush. The footprints lingered. I felt them watching me, cold and deliberate. They did not run. They did not flee. The lantern appeared once more between two ancient pines. A slow sway, hesitant, and then it hovered, trembling, as if unsure I was ready to see it. I wanted to call again, to step closer, but the forest pressed against my ribs. Breath stuck in my throat. The fog coiled, a soft cage of mist and shadow. The lantern faded. I stayed there, still and small, listening. Nothing moved, and yet the footprints remained. The trees exhaled around me. The forest did not forget. And I realized finally that I was not alone. I woke to the soft smell of damp earth and smoke from last night's fire. The frost on the grass had melted to tiny beads of water. The forest felt different. A tent had appeared, just yards from mine, neatly pitched, canvas taut, stakes driven straight into the soil. I froze. No one had been here when I fell asleep. No one had walked near my fire. Yet here it was. I circled it slowly, careful not to snap a twig. The zipper glinted in the pale light. No sounds came from inside. No movement. I knocked once. Nothing. Twice. Still only silence. I crouched, pressing my ear to the canvas. Cold air whispered against my cheek. The ground smelled faintly of fire and wet pine, but no footsteps led away. It was as if it had simply appeared, out of nowhere. I stood back, scanning the fog-draped trees. The branches swayed without wind. A crow cried somewhere above, high in the gray sky, and the sound seemed too sharp, too close. By morning, the tent remained untouched. I hesitated at the zipper, hands shaking. Cold air seeped from the seams, biting my fingers as I pulled it open. Inside, nothing. Sleeping bag rolled neatly. A small lantern in the corner. Empty mugs on a fold-out table. Everything was pristine. No footprints inside. No sign that anyone had slept here. The air was too cold, too still. It pressed against my skin like the forest itself was holding its breath. I stepped back, letting the zipper fall shut. The tent seemed to hum faintly, as if acknowledging my presence. I wanted to leave, but curiosity rooted me to the spot. The fog thickened around the campsite. The trees leaned closer. Even the fire, dying embers, seemed to shrink back. I touched the canvas again. The surface felt almost warm, though the air was icy. A faint rustle brushed my ear. I spun. Nothing. I circled the tent once more, scanning for footprints. There were none leading away. It was as if the tent had been waiting for me to notice it. I sat by my own fire, watching the fog creep across the soil. The forest held its breath. Even the birds stayed silent. When I finally turned to glance at the strange tent, the zipper stirred ever so slightly. No one emerged. No one called my name. I stared into the hollow canvas, feeling the cold creep under my sleeves. The emptiness pressed in, a hollow silence that smelled of damp pine and forgotten paths. By nightfall, I couldn't shake the thought. The tent was not meant for anyone. Not really. It was waiting. The ridge lay ahead, cloaked in fog that clung to the trees like silk. The path was faint, overgrown, forgotten by everyone but the forest. Wooden signs leaned at crooked angles, their letters weathered almost beyond recognition. I stepped onto the trail, boots sinking into moss and frozen soil. The air smelled of damp pine and decaying leaves, sharp in the cold morning. Each breath formed clouds that vanished too quickly. The trees pressed closer as I climbed, branches scratching my sleeves. Light shrank, leaving only shadows and the muted glow of the fog. I thought I heard something step behind me, soft and deliberate. But when I turned, nothing moved. Halfway up, the trail narrowed over a rope bridge. The ropes were frayed, blackened as if burned. At the center, a single boot stood upright, its leather cracked, frozen to the rope, as if someone had paused mid-step. I knelt, reaching toward it. The cold ran through my fingers like frostbite. The forest fell completely silent, the way it does when it's holding its breath. Even the fog seemed to still, curling around the trees in quiet anticipation. The bridge groaned under my weight, though the ropes were mostly gone. Each step felt measured, watched. The boot did not move, did not sway, yet the feeling that someone or something had just left it lingered, heavy in the air. I followed the trail further, broken signs pointing to nowhere. Branches clawed at my jacket, and the earth beneath me felt unsteady. A crow's wings beat somewhere high above, distant, almost mockingly. The trail dipped, winding between twisted trunks. I glimpsed shadows that didn't belong to any tree, pale and thin, flickering at the corner of my vision. I blinked. They vanished. I reached a clearing. The sun barely broke through, pale and weak. The rope bridge stretched behind me, burned and waiting. The boot remained, staring like an empty eye. A wind whispered through the ridge, soft, insistent. I shivered. It wasn't cold enough for this. Something was moving in the fog. The trail ahead led into thicker trees, darker shadows. Every step felt measured, every breath heavy. I wanted to turn back, but curiosity, fragile and sharp, pushed me forward. The forest around me seemed alive, older than the mountain, patient, watching. And the boot remained at the center of the broken bridge. Alone, waiting. I kept climbing, the ridge folding into mist, the trees leaning ever closer. Every sound, snap of a twig, rustle of leaves, was amplified, deliberate, like a warning. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had left a message. The trail had paused, pointed, and waited for someone. And that someone was me. The forest felt different that evening. Mist curled between the trunks, soft as breath. Pine needles clung to my jacket, damp and cold. A sound rose through the trees. At first, I thought it was a wind. A soft, tuneless whistling, weaving through the branches. I paused, letting the quiet press against me. The whistling lingered, curling around the fog. It was slow, deliberate. I tilted my head, listening. The notes were uneven, strange, almost like a voice. I shook my head. It had to be the wind. It had to. But then I heard it more clearly. My name, whispered between the pines. Soft, elongated, bending around the trunks. A pause. And again, the sound didn't shift with the breeze. It repeated, patient, curling closer. It threaded through the fog, around my boots, under my sleeves. I wanted to call out, to answer, but my throat felt frozen. I stepped forward, fog curling around my ankles. Each branch I passed seemed to lean closer, the needles brushing my skin like fingers. The whistling followed, wrapping around me in cold loops. Shadows flickered in the corner of my vision, tall, thin shapes that dissolved when I turned. The forest smelled of wet pine, soil, and something faintly metallic. Every inhale burned the back of my throat. I stopped in a small clearing. The fog wrapped tightly, muffling even the distant river. The whistling rose, insistent, echoing off the trunks. It was all around me now, circling, patient. I held my breath, straining. The sound twisted my name again. Closer, lower. It slid along my shoulders, curling into my hair. I wanted to look behind me. Every instinct screamed not to, and yet my eyes shifted. Nothing. Only fog. Only leaning pines. Only the trail disappearing into gray. The forest seemed to inhale. The whistling softened, drawn into the mist. But I could still feel it. Patient. Waiting. I moved on, small steps, careful. Each branch whispered. Each root seemed to twitch underfoot. The sound never left completely, just a soften at the edges of hearing, like breath against my ear. By nightfall, the forest was still, yet every shadow felt alive. Every rustle could have been the whistling returning. And I realized it wasn't just the wind anymore. It knew my name. The edge of camp was quiet. Mist curled low along the ground, damp and heavy. The fire had burned to embers, its warmth fading into the night air. I noticed the stones first. A small pile, carefully balanced, leaning just slightly like it had been placed with care. I hadn't seen it when I arrived. And yet, here it was. I knelt, brushing a finger over the top rock. Cold, smooth, perfectly stacked, almost deliberate. The forest smelled faintly of wet stone and frost. The fog clung around my ankles, dense and patient. I toppled it, just one careless push. The stones clattered into the dirt. The forest exhaled, or maybe it was just the wind. But by morning, 2 cairns stood where one had been. Identical, balanced, patient. I ran my hands over the new stones. No footprints led to them. No sign of anyone who could have built them. Only the soil pressed and smooth, as if waiting for my fingers. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Every branch seemed to lean closer, watching. Even the mist seemed to shimmer, in quiet acknowledgement. I circled the cairns slowly, careful not to disturb them. The forest held its breath. A faint rustle, like pebbles sliding across dirt, made me freeze. No one was there. The sound came again, soft, deliberate, a pattern I couldn't recognize. I stared at the 2 piles. They were small, fragile, almost insignificant, but impossible to ignore. The balance, the patience, the quiet insistence of their presence pressed in. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision. Fog curled like fingers around my boots. I wanted to leave, to turn away, but curiosity rooted me to the spot. The forest felt alive, waiting, listening, and the cairns, they weren't just markers. They were invitations. I knelt once more, brushing dirt from the rocks. The fog twisted around me, heavy and cold. A soft hum, almost imperceptible, rose from the soil beneath my knees. It stopped the moment I lifted my hand. By noon, the cairns remained. The forest had returned to its quiet rhythm, but I could still feel the weight of those stones. Watching, patient, I left the edge of camp slowly. The cairn stayed behind, silent and balanced, and I knew they would be waiting. The snow lay heavy on the slope, soft and unbroken. Trees leaned under its weight, silent sentinels in the pale light. I spotted the cabin before I realized I was even looking. Half buried, its roof bowed beneath the snow, windows black, staring. The walls sagged, but the door looked as though someone had used it recently. I stepped closer, boots crunching in the frozen drifts. The cold bit through my gloves, sharp and unrelenting. The air smelled of pine frost and something faintly metallic, like iron left to rust. Inside, the cabin was quiet. The wooden floor creaked under my weight. Mug sat on the table, dusted in snow from the open shutters. A logbook lay in the center, pages fluttering. I picked it up. The last entry ended mid-sentence. "It keeps knocking at the door." The words froze my fingers, and I felt the warmth of unease creep up my spine. Outside, the snow whispered against the walls. And then I heard it, a knock, soft, deliberate, patient, from the other side of the door. I stepped back, breath caught in my throat. Another tap, closer this time. The cabin seemed to inhale around me, with groaning and warning. I dared to glance out the window. Nothing moved, only snow drifting silently over the slope. Yet the knocking continued, echoing faintly, almost waiting. The logbook's pages rustled again. Cold air puffed from the cracks in the walls. I pressed a hand to the table, grounding myself. The tap stopped. I held my breath, listening. The silence was thick, alive. A faint hum, like breath brushing the back of my neck, rose from the shadows. Then nothing. I moved cautiously through the cabin, noting the mugs, the logbook, the small details of someone's life abruptly paused. It was as if the place had been abandoned in a hurry, or abandoned for me to find. Night fell quickly, the pale light fading. Shadows stretched long, curling along the walls. I settled near the fire pit, embers barely warm. Outside, the slope lay quiet, the snow untouched. And yet, I heard it again, a soft knock, rhythmic, deliberate, at the door. I didn't open it. I didn't move. I only listened, pressed to the cold wooden floor, feeling the pulse of the forest outside. The night stretched long. The cabin breathed around me, patient, waiting, and somewhere beyond the walls. It waited too. The fire crackled low, its light stretching thin across the snow-dusted ground. I sat close, boots near the embers, letting the warmth seep into my frozen fingers. The forest pressing around me, dark and patient. Then I heard it, soft footsteps. At first, I thought it was a deer or the wind shifting snow across twigs. But the steps were deliberate, careful, circling, around the fire. Closer, I shined my flashlight toward the sound. Nothing, only shadows twisting between the trunks. The steps moved again, scraping lightly against gravel and dirt. I froze, every nerve alight, listening to the rhythm. It paused, and resumed, closer this time. I leaned forward, breath shallow, hands gripping my knees. The prints began to appear in the dirt, slow, steady. They weren't human, at least not fully. I moved the flashlight again. Still nothing, only the prints, circling endlessly, patient and mocking. The fire hissed, tiny sparks rising, drifting into the cold night air. I held my breath. The forest exhaled, soft and slow, almost whispering around me. The footsteps stopped suddenly, a heartbeat of silence, then a faint rustle in the trees, closer than before. I wanted to call out. I wanted to run. But something rooted me in place, frozen, watching. The footprints shifted, turning back toward the forest edge. And yet, the last set remained at the circle's edge, almost leaning toward me, waiting. I sat very still, letting the embers burn low. Every shadow seemed alive, stretching fingers of darkness toward the fire. Every crackle would sounded too loud, too deliberate. I didn't move for a long while. The footsteps never returned, but the prints stayed, and I knew they weren't going anywhere. I found the photograph nailed to a pine, edges curled, colors faded by years in the forest. It showed the campsite, my campsite, but something felt off. A figure stood behind the tent, tall, blurred, impossibly still. I blinked, and the shape seemed to shift, smudge against the air like smoke. The wind stirred, rustling the needles above. I held the photo closer, breathing shallow, hands trembling. The forest smelled of wet earth and cold wood, faintly metallic. I looked around the campsite. No one, only my fire pit, logs half burned, smoke curling slowly toward gray sky. Yet the photograph pulsed faintly in my fingers, almost alive. I hung it on another tree, trying to see if the figure would vanish. It didn't. The shadowed form stayed behind the tent, blurred as before, patient, quiet. That night I slept fitfully. The dreams came soft at first, fog curling around me, the forest leaning closer. Then the figure appeared, closer than the photograph allowed. Its outline pressed against the shadows, tall and patient. I woke, heart in my throat, listening. The campsite was still, silent, and yet I could feel the presence, hovering, waiting. I returned to the photograph in the morning. The figure had moved slightly, subtle, almost imperceptible. A tilt of the head, a faint blur at the edges of the frame. I carried it with me for the day, fingers gripping it tightly. The forest seemed quieter, but heavier, as if aware. Each shadow in the trees made my stomach tighten, each whisper of wind a warning. By nightfall, I hung the photo back on the pine. The fog thickened, curling low around the campsite. I thought I heard soft footsteps near the tent. Closer, then nothing. But I knew, when I closed my eyes, the figure would be there, waiting. Even the photograph couldn't keep it at a distance. The mountain lake lay ahead, frozen in pale gray spirals. Cracks ran through the ice like veins, delicate and intricate. The air smelled of cold stone and wet pine, sharp against my lungs. I stepped closer, boots crunching faintly on frostbitten gravel. The ice shimmered beneath, shifting as if it were alive. Shadows moved beneath the surface, slow, deliberate, circling. I knelt at the edge, pressing my gloved hand to the ice. Cold surged through me, deep and biting. Each spiral seemed to pulse, almost like a heartbeat trapped beneath glass. The forest leaned closer, fog curling over the water. Every sound, the wind, the crackle of frozen reeds, felt amplified. A faint hum vibrated beneath my fingers, low and insistent. I stepped back, noticing the cracks forming letters. At first, they seemed random, but the shapes twisted into symbols, words almost recognizable. A warning, or an invitation. The shadows beneath the ice shifted again, slow, patient. I blinked. The spiral seemed to pulse, circling outward. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying an echo I couldn't place. I traced the letters with my gaze, fingertips frozen in place. Each breath rose and disappeared into the mist. The forest held its silence. Even the lake seemed to watch, patient and unmoving. When I returned at dawn, the ice had shifted. The letters had changed subtly, reforming into shapes I could almost read. The shadows lingered beneath, slow and deliberate, moving as though aware of my presence. I felt the cold press deeper, like a warning threaded into the air. The spirals twisted endlessly, circling, drawing me closer. And I realized the lake had been waiting, not for me, but for something beneath. The wind sighed through the pines, soft and low. The forest exhaled. The shadows moved again, slow, deliberate. And I stepped back, heart heavy, knowing the lake kept its secrets well. The night was still, the forest wrapped in fog and frost. I sat beside my fire, hands pressed to warm coals, listening to the soft hum of the cold air. Somewhere nearby, a tree creaked, old and patient. I turned the hand-crank radio slowly, its gears whining faintly. Static hissed across the speakers. Then voices, at first mumbled nonsense, fragments of words that made no sense. I tilted my head, listening closer. The forest seemed to lean in, patient, waiting. The voices sharpened, clearer, closer. Soft warnings whispered, "Stay inside. Don't look at it." Each syllable wrapped around my ears like cold fingers. I froze. The fire's glow flickered, shadows stretching long across the snow. The hum of the radio became a low pulse, threading through the trees, curling around my boots. I turned it off briefly, letting silence press against me. The whispers stopped. Or maybe they only went quiet for a moment. I cranked the dial again. The voices returned, insistent, carrying urgency that tightened my chest. A breath, right behind my ear. I spun. The forest remained empty, the fire soft and dying, but the sensation lingered, a presence coiled in the mist. The static hissed, the whispers almost pleading. Don't look, don't. I dropped the radio, hands frozen on my knees. The forest exhaled around me, soft and patient. A branch scraped against the tent, slow, deliberate. The air smelled of pine and snow and something faintly metallic, like iron left out to rust. I didn't move. The whispers faded, replaced by silence so thick it pressed against my ears. And then the last sound wasn't from the radio at all. A breath, cold, close, waiting. I held my own breath, pressed low to the ground. The forest seemed alive, patient, listening. And whatever had whispered through the radio, it had not gone anywhere. The night pressed in thick and quiet. My tent was small, the canvas pulled tight, shivering slightly in the wind. The fire outside had burned low, embers fading into gray ash. Then I heard it, a soft tapping against the canvas. At first, I thought it was rain, but there was no rain, just fingers, slow, careful, circling. I froze, listening. Each tap moved around me, gentle yet deliberate, closer, around my head. I reached for my flashlight. The moment it lit the canvas, the tap stopped, but the tension didn't. The air pressed against my skin, thick, patient, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The zipper stirred above me. A faint rustle, deliberate, almost teasing. I swallowed hard. The fog outside whispered through the flaps, curling inside the tent like cold breath. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, a branch, the wind, but the rhythm of the taps was too precise, too knowing. I pressed my back to the sleeping bag, listening. The forest exhaled around the tent, leaves brushing softly, distant, patient. The taps resumed slowly, circling, pausing, shifting closer. I closed my eyes, counted my breaths. Every inhale was heavy. Every exhale whispered back from the forest. Then silence. The tapping stopped. The zipper stayed still. I didn't move for long minutes. The canvas sagged with stillness. But I knew the presence lingered. Patient, waiting. When I finally drifted toward uneasy sleep, I felt it, soft, deliberate, curling around the edges of my mind. A tapping that never truly ended. The snow pressed underfoot, deep and soft. The forest was silent, frost clinging to every branch. A faint smell of smoke lingered, dry and sharp, though no fire burned nearby. Then I saw it, a trail of ash, black against the white snow. It stretched forward, winding between the trees, deliberate, unnatural. I followed it slowly. Each step sank into powdery frost, muffling my own movement. The ash crunched faintly under my boots. The trees along the path were burned black, though no fire had touched the surrounding forest. A cold hum rose through the branches, subtle, almost imperceptible. The air pressed against my cheeks, sharp and patient. I reached for a tree, brushing away frost, and the ash beneath my fingers seemed to whisper. The trail led deeper, twisting between trunks that leaned like watchers. The fog hung heavy, curling at my ankles, obscuring the path behind me. I felt eyes, countless, patient, pressing through the mist. At the end, a lantern lay buried in the dirt, pale and delicate, swaying slightly, though no wind moved it. I knelt, brushing the snow from its surface. Cold ran through my fingers like frostbite. It felt alive. The forest exhaled. Branches scraped softly overhead, shadows bending closer. I could hear faint whispers, almost in rhythm with the sway of a lantern. Patient, waiting. I stood slowly, heart heavy, lantern in hand. The ash trail behind me glimmered faintly, like it had been watching. The burned trees along the path seemed to lean closer, their blackened trunks silent sentinels. I looked back once more. The trail of ash ended, but the forest held its breath. Even the snow seemed to press down, heavy and expectant. I realized then this was not just a path. It was an invitation, a warning, and the lantern, it would not stay buried for long. I found it hanging from a gnarled branch, an iron bell, rusted but intact, swaying faintly in the cold breeze. The forest smelled of wet pine and decaying leaves, sharp in the frozen air. I stepped closer. The ground beneath me was soft with frost, muffling my own footsteps. The bell seemed impossibly still, patient. Midnight came with a sigh. The forest grew heavier, fog curling low to the ground. Then the bell rang. No one had pulled it. No wind stirred. A single, clear note rolled across the valley, echoing and lingering. It reverberated in my chest, deep and insistent. I held my breath, listening. The sound stretched too long, folding into the fog. It carried a weight, a presence I could not see. A whisper threaded through the echoes, like voices calling back. I stepped closer, fingers brushing the rusted iron. The note rang again, faint, deliberate, rolling across the slope. Shadows in the fog twisted, leaning closer to the sound. I felt it then, something patient, watching, moving just beyond the reach of light. The forest seemed to hum in rhythm with the bell, branches brushing together softly, echoing the metallic note. I didn't move. The echoes lingered. The fog seemed heavier. Each sound pressed into the mist, amplifying the silence between. A single wind stirred, brushing my cheek, carrying the faint metallic smell of iron. The bell rang again, faint this time, a last call. I shivered. The sound rolled across the valley, stretching further than it should, touching every tree, every shadow. And then silence. The forest exhaled, patient, as if it had been holding its breath the entire time. The bell swayed gently, rusted and quiet. I stepped back, heart tight. Somewhere deep in the trees, I could almost hear faint whispers responding to its call. Patient, waiting. The river wound through the forest like a pale ribbon. Its surface shimmered under the fading light, cold and smooth. I followed its curve, boots crunching on frost-covered rocks. Then I saw him, a man pale-eyed, standing at the edge of the water. He looked at me, still and quiet, like a shadow leaning from the trees. I approached slowly, heart tight. He spoke, voice low, almost a whisper carried on the river's breath. Pack up, leave before dusk. I wanted to ask why, to thank him, to understand. But when I turned to respond, he was gone. Only wet prints marked the rocks where he had stood. No other footprints trailed behind. The river murmured over stone, carrying his warning in soft, deliberate whispers. I bent down, tracing the prints. Cold water dripped from my gloves. They were human, but something about them felt wrong. Too perfect, too deliberate. The forest pressed in, patient, watching. Branches leaned like hands, shadows stretching long over the snow. I felt eyes in the mist, lingering, unseen. I walked along the river slowly, each step cautious. The echo of his voice seemed to follow, fading only to return. Leave before dusk. It was not a threat. It was certainty. I glanced back again. Nothing, only the river, smooth and patient, reflecting the gray sky, and the wet prints. By nightfall, the fog wrapped the forest tight. I camped nearby, the fire small, fragile against the pressing dark. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, moving as if anticipating my next step. The man never returned, but the warning lingered, curling through the trees, soft as mist, heavy as frost. I knew then I should have listened. The river murmured on, patient, quiet, waiting. The frozen wall of ice stretched before me, tall and smooth. Its surface caught the pale light, reflecting the forest like a pale, fractured mirror. The air smelled of frost and pine, crisp and biting against my lungs. I stepped closer, breath fogging the glass, and then I saw it, not just my reflection. Someone stood behind me, tall, still, breath fogging the ice so the air around me was perfectly still. I froze, heart tight, staring at the smooth surface. I turned slowly. Nothing. The snow beneath my boots was untouched, soft and clean. The forest remained quiet, patient. I blinked. The reflection hadn't changed. The figure remained, coiled in shadow, waiting. A soft hum rose through the pines, low and insistent. Branches scratched against each other, faint as whispers. I pressed a hand to the ice, cold biting through my glove. The figure mirrored my movement. I stepped back. The fog on the glass swirled slightly, curling around the shape behind me. Each breath I drew seemed to echo, trapped within the frozen mirror. The forest exhaled around me, patient and expectant. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn. But my gaze stayed fixed on the reflection, the impossible figure. Slowly I circled the ice, tracing the edges of the wall. Everywhere I looked, it followed. Patient, silent, waiting. The wind shifted. I could feel it through my hair, cold and sharp, pressing against my neck. The figure did not move. It did not blink. It simply waited, coiled in the reflection, as if the forest itself had placed it there. I backed away, leaving the ice behind. But in the quiet, heavy forest, I could still feel it watching. Patient, silent, and closer than I dared to breathe. The cliffs rose above me, jagged and gray, mist curling at their edges. The forest fell away, leaving only the wind and the thin edge of snow-dusted stone. I paused, boots heavy, listening. At first, I thought it was the wind, a distant cry, high and sharp, echoing across the gorge. I held my breath. The sound repeated, closer this time and more deliberate. I strained to listen. No other hikers, no animals, just the echoing, piercing scream folding into itself. Night came quickly, drawing shadows over rocks. The forest leaned in, patient, silent, and the screams returned, closer, crawling through the rocks beneath my tent, low and urgent. I tried to tell myself it was the cliffs, the wind, the shape of the valley carrying sound. But each night it grew closer, sharper, threading to the snow and fog. I felt it coil around my legs, climb the slopes, pressing toward me. The mist clung to my boots. The smell of wet stone and pine thickened the air. Every heartbeat was loud, echoing against the rocks. Each exhale seemed swallowed by the gorge. I climbed higher, tracing the edge of the cliffs, trying to understand. The screams twisted around me, low, patient, insistent. A strange rhythm in the echoes, deliberate and sharp. I crouched near a ledge, listening. The snow beneath my hands was icy and soft, giving slightly under my fingers. The echoes whispered through the stones, curling up to my ears, impossibly close. I wanted to flee, to descend into the forest below, but the sound drew me onward, closer to the edge, each scream a warning and a lure at the same time. By dawn, the gorge was still. The wind was gentle, the mist curling in soft loops. And yet, the memory of those screams lingered, patient, crawling through the rocks, waiting for nightfall to return. The old fire watchtower loomed above the trees, tall and silent. It was gray with age, splintered in places, leaning slightly as if bowing to the forest. The wind whispered through the branches, faint, patient. I climbed slowly, each step creaking under my boots. The logbooks had opened at the top, pages fluttering in the cold breeze. I leaned closer, reading the final line. It climbed the stairs after me. The words pressed against my chest. I froze, fingers gripping the railing, eyes scanning the shadows beneath the tower. A faint creak, another, footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoed from below. I held my breath. The forest exhaled around me, patient, silent. Each step paused, then continued, climbing the wooden stairs. The wind shifted. Branches scraped softly against the tower, shadows twisting across the planks. I could feel the presence moving closer, coiling around the edges of the structure. I wanted to call out. I wanted to descend, but my boots felt heavy, as if the tower itself held me in place. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Creak, pause, creak, each step deliberate, patient, echoing against the wood. I leaned over the railing, looking down. Nothing, only shadows pooling in the forest below, bending, waiting. I turned back to the logbook. The final word seemed to hum softly, carried on the cold breeze. It climbed after me. A single board groaned beneath me. The steps below continued. Closer, patient. I didn't move. The forest waited, and the tower held its breath. The fire crackled low, orange flickers stretching shadows across the snow. I sat close, boots pressed to the warmth, listening to the trees lean quietly around the campsite. The night was still, heavy with frost and fog. Then I noticed the shapes. In the smoke, pale faces formed, flickering, hollow. They leaned closer as the fire dimmed, silent, watching. I blinked, and they shifted slightly, drifting with the curling smoke. The forest smelled of wet pine, ash, and cold stone. Each inhale was sharp, heavy, pressing through quiet. I reached out instinctively. The smoke rippled under my fingers, impossible to touch. The faces whispered without voices, subtle, deliberate, patient. I leaned back, heart tight. Every shadow seemed to pulse, stretching toward the fire. The faces leaned closer, hollow eyes fixed on me. Patient, waiting. The embers sank lower, the flames shrinking, the night pressing in. I could feel their presence in the quiet, brushing against the edges of my mind. Each flicker of smoke seemed to breathe, curling like fingers toward me. I held my breath, waiting. The fire hissed softly, sparks drifting into the snow. The faces did not fade, not fully. They lingered in the shadows, twisting with the smoke, patient, silent. The wind sighed to the pines, faint and deliberate. Branches scratched softly against the ground, echoing the shapes in the fire. The forest seemed to lean in closer, the snow crunching faintly under unseen feet. I didn't move. I couldn't. The faces had claimed the edges of the firelight, patient, waiting. And I knew, even when the flames died completely, they would remain. Fog rolled down the slope, thick and heavy, curling around tree trunks like fingers. The forest was quiet, the snow muted under its weight. And then I saw it. A single cabin window, glowing faintly through the gray. It called to me, patient and still, a promise in the mist. I walked closer, boots crunching softly over frozen soil. The door was solid, unbroken. Yet I felt an odd pull, a presence pressing against the air. I knocked. No answer. The glow inside didn't shift. The cabin smelled of cold wood and something faintly metallic, like iron left to rust. I circled it slowly, listening to the faint hum of the forest around me. Night fell quickly, and the mist thickened, pressing against my jacket. Shadows leaned and twisted in the fog, patient, silent. I waited a long moment, pressing my hand to the door. Still nothing. Morning came pale and soft. I returned to the same spot. The cabin was gone. Only trees, still and patient, pressed against the fog. I blinked. The ground was undisturbed. No footprints. No sign it had ever been there. The mist curled around the trees, heavy and quiet. The forest exhaled softly, patient, as if the cabin had never existed. And yet, the memory of the faint glow lingered in my chest, patient, waiting. I left the slope slowly, boots pressing into the snow. The fog shifted around me, curling like breath. The cabin had vanished. And I realized some things only appear to those who are meant to see them. Snow began to fall thick and heavy, drifting silently from the gray sky. The flakes landed without a sound, soft as breath, pressing the forest into hushed stillness. The air smelled of cold pine and frost, sharp and clean. I walked slowly, boots sinking into the powder, yet every step sounded muted. No crunch, no hiss, only the quiet pressing around me. The trees leaned under the weight of snow, patient and silent. Then I heard it, saw footsteps, crunching, deliberate, moving through the fresh snow. I stopped listening, heart tight, but there were no footprints to follow. None at all. The air felt heavier, pressing close to my chest. Branches swayed slightly, though the wind was still. Every inhale seemed louder than it should be, echoing in the frozen hush. I turned slowly, scanning the white expanse. The snow fell thick, muffling everything, except those steps, patient, circling, impossible. I tried to convince myself it was an animal or perhaps my own imagination. But the rhythm continued, deliberate, pressing closer. The forest itself seemed to shift in response, shadows curling beneath the snow-laden branches. I held my breath, listening. The snow sank silently beneath me, yet the footsteps pressed on, patient, unseen. I could feel them in the edges of my vision, curling around the trees, brushing my thoughts with cold certainty. I moved slowly, careful not to disturb the silence. The forest waited with me, patient, watching. Every flake fell softly, every shadow pressed close. And the footsteps, they would not stop. Thin strings dangled from the branches, swaying even though the air was still. Feathers and small stones were tied to them, drifting softly like suspended whispers. The forest smelled of wet pine and damp earth, heavy and patient. I stepped closer, boots crunching softly in the frost. The strings brushed my jacket, cool and deliberate, curling against my skin. I felt eyes in the mist, patient, watching. At night, they moved differently, pulling against the tent, tugging tight as though something beneath the canopy was climbing upward. I pressed my hands to the canvas, heart tight, listening to the faint scrape of fibers over the roof. Branches leaned closer. The fog curled at the edges of clearing, coiling like breath. Each feather on the string swayed as though following invisible fingers. I tried to count them, measure them, understand. The more I looked, the more they tangled, twisting with patience, deliberate in their motion. Something pressed against the edges of the tent, patient, unseen. The forest exhaled softly. A branch scratched lightly close, deliberate. The strings tightened, brushing the canvas, curling over my sleeping bag. I held my breath. The wind did not move, and yet the strings moved, patient, circling, wrapping around the tent like invisible fingers. Waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I only listened to the faint, deliberate pull of the strings, the patient hum of the forest, and the feeling that something was trying to climb inside. Deep in the woods, I found a fire still smoldering. The embers hissed faintly, curling threads of smoke into the frostbitten air. Sleeping bags lay scattered, coffee cups half full, untouched. No campers remained. No footprints led away. Only the faint, lingering warmth and the hiss of the dying fire. I stepped closer, boots crunching softly in the frost. The smoke curled around my fingers, carrying the smell of pine and cold ash. A subtle hum rose from the logs, low and deliberate, almost alive. I touched the sleeping bag. Cold, stiff. The frost pressed against my gloves, patient. It was as if someone or something had just left, moving without sound. Branches leaned close overhead, shadows twisting between trunks. The forest exhaled slowly, pressing around me, waiting. Every step I took felt heavier, deliberate, echoing too loudly in the quiet. The embers hissed again, a soft, almost whispering sound. I froze. A branch shifted nearby, though no wind moved it. Something had passed, patient and unseen, leaving only the faint trace of presence. I circled the campfire slowly. Each coffee cup, each sleeping bag, seemed to hold a memory of what had been here. And yet, the air hummed with absence, a weight pressing against the frost, patient, deliberate. I left quietly, boots pressing into the snow. The fire hissed softly behind me, and I knew whatever had been here had not gone far. Near the cliff edge, I saw it, a pale figure, motionless, head tilted. The snow around it was untouched, pristine. At first, I thought it was another hiker. I stepped closer, boots crunching softly over frost. The figure remained perfectly still. Its eyes, I couldn't tell. They were pale, blank, patient. I blinked. The snow beneath its feet showed no prints. No trail leading here. Nothing but the figure, waiting. I looked away for a second. When I turned back, it was closer, patient, silent. The wind pressed against my cheeks, sharp and cold. Branches scraped faintly overhead, echoing in the frozen silence. I felt my heart tighten, every breath loud in the stillness. I want to call out, to demand it move, speak, anything, but the air itself seemed to hold me in place. Patient, waiting. I circled cautiously, trying to find a way past. The snow remained unbroken, the figure always just beyond reach. It mirrored the forest in stillness, a shadow coiled in the pale, white air. Night fell slowly, gray and quiet. I retreated from the edge, boots pressing softly into the snow. The figure did not follow, but I could feel it in the corners of my vision. Patient, silent, waiting. Even as the cliffs receded behind me, I knew it would linger. A presence coiled in the frost, closer than I dared to breathe. Dawn broke pale and thin over the ridge. The forest was quiet, still heavy with frost and mist. Then bells began ringing. At first, faint, soft echoes bouncing from nowhere, carrying across the valley. The sound rolled over the snow, over the trees, patient and deliberate. I climbed the ridge slowly, boots crunching softly in frost. The bells grew louder, clearer, striking with rhythm I could not place. And below, through the thickening fog, shapes began to move, dozens of them, pale and silent, drifting through the mist. They answered the bells with whispers, low and deliberate, curling around the trees. The fog curled at my boots, pressing close, heavy with quiet expectation. The sound of the bells lingered in my chest, reverberating through the air. Every shadow seemed to twist, bending closer with each strike. The whispers joined, patient, echoing from tree to tree, blending with the frostbitten wind. I paused, hand pressed to the snow, breath visible in the cold. The shapes below moved as one, deliberate, patient, almost ritualistic. The bells continued, faint yet insistent, echoing across the frozen valley. Branches scraped together softly, the forest leaning in to listen. The fog thickened, swirling around my legs, around the ridge, around the shapes below. The bells rang again, deliberate, patient, and the whispers responded, soft, endless. I stepped back, boots pressing into snow, heart tight. The forest exhaled. The fog curled. The bells echoed. The shapes waited, patient, watching. And I knew the valley itself held its breath, waiting for what would come next. I returned to camp on the last night. The forest was quiet, heavy with frost and mist. But the campsite, it was gone, torn down, scattered. My lantern lay shattered, my gear strewn across the snow. The trees pressed in, patient, silent. The forest smelled of cold pine and ash, sharp and expectant. I stepped forward, boots crunching softly, careful. The snow was untouched, yet I could feel something moving just beyond the ridge. The silence pressed against me, heavy, deliberate. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, patient, circling. I froze, heart tight, breath rising in soft clouds. The steps moved closer, pressing against the snow, without leaving prints. Patient, deliberate, watching. I reached for my lantern, fingers brushing the broken glass. The shards were cold, sharp. I couldn't light it. The forest had swallowed the light. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent flap. I held my breath, pressed low to the ground. And then a voice, soft, whispering my name. Patient, waiting. I didn't move. The snow, the trees, the frost-tinged air, all held their breath. And I knew it had been here all along, watching, waiting, patient, and I could not escape. The forest exhaled. The snow sank silently beneath my boots. And I sat still, knowing the footsteps, the voice, the presence, would not leave.